Good evening, everyone. First of all, what an amazing film and a great way to kick off the evening. So let me introduce myself as the guy with the funny accent up front. I'm Bruce Lieboff, Chair of the Board of UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the launch of the Ontario Jewish Archives Blankenstein Family Heritage Center's Southern African Legacy Project. I can't wait to see the acronym that goes with that. The OJA is a department of UJA Federation, and we're delighted to support the important work they do in collecting, preserving, and sharing our community's history. Founded over 40 years ago, the OJA is the largest repository of Jewish life in Canada. If you've never visited the OJA, I highly recommend you do so. They have a state-of-the-art facility which was recently, I would say, upgraded, renovated, courtesy of the Government of Canada's largesse, I guess with our money. But anyway, it's a great space to visit. The OJA's mandate of preserving and sharing our community's history is aligned with UJA's strategic priority of strengthening Jewish identity. We recognize that all of us benefit when we celebrate the rich diversity of our community. And so we're thrilled to celebrate the stories and contributions of the Southern African Jewish immigrants that chose Canada as their home. As the OJA likes to say, your stories are our stories. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and for participating in this important project. And thank you to the generous sponsors of this project, in particular Tony and Val Melman, Spin Master Toys, and to the many individuals who also generously supported it. Additionally, thank you to the Southern African Legacy Project Committee. Let's call it the SALPC. It's much easier to say. Without their support and efforts, we wouldn't be here tonight. So I'll just mention them to you. Colin Baskin, John Cohen, Michael Meyer, Lorraine Sandler, I saw Lorraine, Richard Stern, and Heather Super. And a special thanks to the chair of the committee, Stephen Pincus. His steadfast commitment to the project ensured his success, his legendary tenacity benefiting his clients by day and this project by night. So thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of Ontario Jewish Archives Chair Eric Slavens, and note it's been I guess a 6-year run for you, Eric, soon to come to an end. So thank you for your leadership and guidance and for connecting the OJA with this initial group of Southern Africans. And I just want to say, the UJA annual campaign is the engine that drives our entire community. The 100+ agencies we support, as well as institutions like the Ontario Jewish Archives, it keeps our community strong. So for those of you who've already supported the annual campaign, I thank you. And if not, I'm sure there's staff people here who would be happy to help, even me, following the event. So with that, I want to welcome Eric to the stage to say a few words and enjoy the evening.
Good evening. Hoyand. We're very pleased to have you here this evening. The Southern African Legacy Project has been a wonderful journey for the Ontario Jewish Archives. I was personally familiar with your community through my friendship over the years with many of you, going back to the early 70s when I first met John Cohen. Several years ago, we at the Ontario Jewish Archives realized that we had little material related to stories of the Southern Africans who had made such a significant impact on our community. We launched this project in 2014 to ensure that your community's presence and contributions are preserved in perpetuity, and that your stories can be shared with the wider community. Over the course of the project, dozens of Southern Africans met the OJA's team of archivists to share memories and provide photographs, letters, speeches, recipes, scrapbooks, and other records detailing their experience, both in Southern Africa and Ontario. To complement the archival material, the Ontario Jewish Archives also recorded oral histories with close to 30 individuals representing different cross-sections of your community, such as people who immigrated in different decades and came at different stages of their lives. The collection that has emerged holds a wealth of information about Ontario's Jewish Southern African community, why you left South Africa and Zimbabwe, why you chose or why you ended up in Canada, which is sometimes different, initial impressions of Canada, the challenges you faced when integrating into life here, the differences and similarities in Jewish traditions, the important role that you've played in Ontario's Jewish community, and your contributions to Canadian society. While the Ontario Jewish Archives previously held almost no material on the Southern African community, it now holds a significant collection of material representing the stories of close to 100 Southern African families. Tonight, we are pleased to share this important project with you and to launch the website, which you saw on the screen, ojasalp.org, where dozens of these stories are preserved and shared. At this point, I would like to thank our OJA team, our Executive Director, Dara Solomon, our Managing Director, Donna Bernardo Cerise, the incredible team of archivists, Faye Bloom and Michael Friesen, and former Ontario Jewish archivist Melissa Kaza, who spearheaded this project and who has come back tonight to celebrate with us. I want to also thank the Ontario Jewish Archive staff for planning such a special evening to celebrate this important project, especially Faye Bloom, who coordinated all of the details of this event. I'd now like to introduce Stephen Pincus, who is the chair of our committee and will be moderating the panel this evening. Stephen is a senior partner at Goodman's, where he heads the capital markets practice. He grew up in Johannesburg, where he matriculated at King Edward School with distinctions and studied English and philosophy at Wits University. He was head of Habonim, South Africa's largest Jewish youth movement, and its summer camp. He was also elected chair of the South African Zionist Youth Council. In his early 20s, Stephen and his wife Michelle were members of the group that established Kibbutz Tuval in Israel's Western Galilee. In 1982, they moved to Toronto, where Stephen served as administrator of Bialik Hebrew Day School and camp director of Camp Shalom, while he was completing his MBA and LLB degrees. I almost called it a disease, the lawyer's disease, but it's LLB degree. And he won the gold medal at Osgood Law School. Stephen is the founding chair of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, a director of Q Media Group, a member of the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency for Israel, chair of the board of Macom, and founder of Kaleidoscope, a unique multi-dimensional Israel engagement program. Please join me in welcoming the committee chair of the South African Legacy Project, Stephen Pincus.
Thanks so much, Eric. This feels like being at a simcha. You know, there's a word that my late mother used, which kind of describes the feeling that I have here, looking around at so many friends, and it's a Yiddish term, Agana. And that's what this project's all about. This is a project about us It's a time to celebrate. And I want to firstly thanks Bruce and Eric for initiating this through the UJA Federation and the archives. And thank you so much to Dara and Melissa and Faye and the team at OJA for putting this all together. Both the project, I can't believe it's 2014. You said, I remember when Eric called me up and he said, we got this idea to do this little thing, gather a few documents and stuff, and it sort of grew. And I know that I put demands on the team way beyond what they were expecting. I think in hindsight they would have chosen somebody else to do this. But the committee was just fabulous. I mean, it started with Colin and John and Alan Farber. I don't know if the Farbers are here tonight. And then Heather joined us, and Richard, and Michael Mayer, and who am I leaving out? And Lorraine. Lorraine's always a huge force. I mean, the Sandlers are just a huge force in the community. It says something about the impact. I think Alan was also chair of the UJA Federation. And listen, what we could do. I mean, I'll tell you what. We'll do a poll. We could either do the panel, or we could sort of go around the room and we could talk about each one of you and what you've brought to Toronto and to Canada, because the impact has been huge. And that's one of the things that motivated me to get involved in this project. There's been quite a lot done in different communities around the world to document the South African immigration into those communities, and the Kaplan Center in South Africa has spent a lot of time documenting the immigration. We're going to talk a little bit about that with Randall in a moment, who did our study. But just overall, if you take a step back from all of this, it's really an incredible thing. At the end of the 19th century, there was this influx of for some of it was our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents from Eastern Europe and into South Africa and, of course, Southern Africa, Zimbabwe. The Zimbabweans are always at the heart of these sorts of projects, and they had that generation and their kids and grandchildren had a huge impact on South Africa in many different areas, and then starting in the middle of the century and increasing through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, you had this next stage immigration. I mean, that's probably the history of the Jewish people. It's been like that for thousands of years. But those of us who came to Canada, I think, have enjoyed. Somebody expressed it very well. I think it was Adele Farber. We've enjoyed, a really blessed environment, community, lifestyle, and I think we've made an impact on it. And tonight is about exploring that impact. And so I would like to. The impact, just to be clear, is in so many different fields. We can see it tangibly in architecture, in education, in medicine, in law, in business, in finance, accounting, in music. I can go on and on and on, and you'll think through where you fit in there and the people that you know, and that impact has been profound on Toronto, on Canada, on the Jewish community with leadership. The late Keith Landy, who was head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and so many others, and that continues. And so, also though, the community as a whole has had such an impact on Toronto and the Jewish community around, and through our children and grandchildren has really spawned something that's quite special in the community. I can say that because most of us in this room are from that community, aren't going to argue with me, but I think it's something we'll explore a little bit more in a moment. I want to introduce our panel, somebody who's had a huge impact on media and broadcasting in Canada. Ismay Benny, come up, please. Ismay, I'll introduce them as they come up, but briefly, Ismay graduated from WITS and then started her career as a librarian, and that led her to become one of the most respected women in Canadian broadcasting, a recipient of numerous honors and awards for contributions to Canadian television, and her most recent full-time employment was as general manager and vice president of several CTV specialty services, including Bravo, the Comedy Network, Space, Book Television, Driving Classics, TV Land Canada. I'm gonna spare them a lot of the rest. It's a huge resume. But one thing I should mention is her recently published memoir, White School Days: Coming of Age in Apartheid South Africa, and I've read it, and it's something that I'd recommend to you all. I'm going to introduce Randall Schnur. Randall is a PhD professor of sociology at York University. He specializes in the qualitative study of Canadian Jewish life. He's been teaching Jewish studies at the Koshitsky Center and has published sociological works on Jewish identity, Jewish day schools, Hasidic Jews, gay Jews, among other contemporary topics. Together with his colleague Alex Thompson, in 2018, he published a book entitled Jewish Family Identity and Self-Formation at Home. And we asked him to undertake this sociological study, which he'll talk a little bit more about, of the Southern African Jewish immigration to Toronto. It will be available after this evening for all of you. I think it'll actually be sent out, Dara, to everybody who's signed up. You'll all get a copy, and it's a significant work. We're not going to have we're just going to have time to scratch the surface this evening, but it's something that I think you'll all find fascinating. Last but not least, the executive director of the Ontario Jewish Archives, Dara Solomon, who has led this project on behalf of with her team at the OJA. And she's going to share her insights with us on the project. Prior to joining OJA, Dara was curator of the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. She also held positions at University of California, Berkeley Art Museum, and she holds an MA in Arts Administration and a BA in Religion and Art History. So with that, we are going to dive in to our discussions. So, as mentioned, is this working? Okay. In the early 20th century, South Africa held such promise for Eastern European Jews, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. But before the century was out, there was this massive immigration. So let's start with Randall, and maybe you can tell us where they went and why.
Okay. So if we can get the slides on the screen. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the committee and to the OJA. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this study as part of this larger project. I'm not South African, as you can hear. I have learned a great deal about Southern Africans. I went to school with many, the Coburn family in particular, as some of you may know from chat. But turning to immigration, we see that there have been 5 major locations that Southern Africans have tended to emigrate to. And as you can see there, Israel, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Now, Canada has actually been not one of the more popular choices in comparison to other places. I often heard about problems with the weather. I don't know what that's about, but that is one reason. But in any case, we can see that Canada would receive in these 3 periods approximately 10 or 12%, but it has added up to the point where there are several thousand now, mostly in Toronto, but in other places as well. We don't have on this particular chart after 2000, but we have knowledge that these trends have, for the most part, been fairly consistent, with Australia continuing to be one of the more popular places in recent years. So that's a word about some of the immigration patterns.
Now, just to, and perhaps we're not stop the recording for a moment because we're not allowed to say this, but we did, in the last few days, get some additional up-to-date information from the Kaplan Center in Cape Town. They haven't published these, but I think, and so we promised we wouldn't put them on a slide, but I think it's fair to say that between 2000 and 2015, where the latest data go, the trends are quite similar to those trends. And the very interesting trend in that for me was the stability of the percentage that came to Toronto, whereas as you can see, some of the other destinations moved up and down during the different periods. There seems to be a lot of consistency in about sort of the 10% range.
And I was surprised to learn from the Kaplan Center that the numbers are still sizable in terms of those who are leaving in the last 15 years, whereas I had thought that perhaps they were slowing down. They were somewhat sizable.
So let's go down from the sort of theoretical, sociological level down to the personal. And I'm going to throw a question at Ismay. Why did you leave South Africa, and why did you choose Canada, and are you pleased that you did?
I can't quite answer the question that way because I didn't leave South Africa to come here. I left South Africa first to live in the UK, and then I lived for 5 years in the United States. I didn't choose to come to Canada. I followed a man to Canada. So I think that, it was a very wise decision, though he's not in my life, but the decision was one of the best I could have made, and I love being a Canadian. I think it has been a blessed choice for me.
All right, so we'll get into that a little bit more in some more detail, but let's turn to Dara, and since you've spent so much time with, probably more than you would have wanted, some of us, over the last few years, and listening to our stories, gathering materials, reviewing them, what strikes you as the key differences between South African Jews and the overall Jewish community that you've obviously got a lot of experience with, and can you illustrate that a little bit?
Sure. First, I want to say I couldn't have done this without our wonderful team of archivists, so I just want to thank them, especially Melissa Kaza, who's here tonight, who really is the one who met with so many of you and led the Oral History Project as well, so thank you, Melissa. So I think some of the things we noticed was definitely the warmth and humor of the community. We're so excited to be sharing their stories with us, and had felt somewhat a little bit on the outside of the mainstream Jewish life in Toronto, and we're so grateful to have the opportunity to share their stories with us.
Can I just jump in on that note?
Sure.
Of all the studies I've done many studies on Jewish communities. This is probably the most enthusiastic and easiest group to find people to participate in a study. Thank you. So we had over 450 people participate in the study, and there was great enthusiasm. So thank you so much.
Something we noticed was the gratitude to be in Canada, although so many recognize that Canada wasn't initially their first choice and were taken aback by the cold weather and driving on the opposite side. They did really express how grateful they were to be in Canada and for everything that we sort of celebrate in Canada, the multiculturalism and the being able to achieve what they wanted in business and in all their professions. And so I think that is something that Canadians sort of don't necessarily think about as much because we've always sort of been here and maybe take for granted. And that was definitely a part of one of the differences that I found.
Okay. So Randall, there's some striking differences between your study and a similar study that was done in London and published a number of years ago. And just to summarize what I understand, and I'd love you to expand on this. I think as I understand, we're less recognizable as South Africans in the community here than South Africans are in London. We're more at home here than they are in London, and we're less attached to South Africa than they are in London. Now, how far apart are the numbers on these, and what do you think are the reasons for the differences?
Okay, so if we could put the slides up again. Just going to skip ahead to some of this slide here is very interesting. We simply just need to look at the blue bar here. The question is, what is your level of identification? And the blue bar says, I strongly identify. And I don't know if it's large enough to see. There's 4 categories: Jewish, Canadian, Zionist, and South African. So again, we're just looking at the blue bar. So you see Jewish has the highest level of strong identification. So Jewish is first. This is for our Canadian sample. And Canadian is second. So in terms of priority of identity, Jewish, Canadian, followed by Zionist, followed by South African. Fourth most important identity. Now, as Stephen said, in this study, we had the opportunity to compare our data to a similar study done in the United Kingdom of Southern Africans who had emigrated to the United Kingdom. And we asked many of the same questions so that we would be able to compare. Now, very interestingly, the Southern Africans in the UK said that their top identity was Jewish, same as Canadian, but that British came last, not second like Canadian came last. And this, I think, is a strong suggestion, as Stephen said, that the community here seems to feel very at home, and more so, it seems, than South African Jews do in the UK. And we had other questions that lent further support to that, in terms of a larger proportion actually said they feel more at home. Just going to take a look at a couple more questions we had on that. Oh yeah, you mentioned, so equivalent to that was a lesser attachment to South Africa. Now, to be honest, I wasn't sure what the reaction was going to be here. Are people going to like that or not? But there seems to be a lesser attachment to South Africa among Canadians than those in England. So I'm just going to turn to another slide here, where we have here those who came in 2000 or later have 34% have a very strong attachment to South Africa. Those who came earlier have a lesser attachment. But let's say in the middle, about 25% of the sample in this study say that they have a very strong attachment to South Africa. However, those who went to the UK, 42% said they had a very strong attachment. So I'm not sure what the reasons are. Maybe you know better than me. Certainly people have a lot of sentimentality towards South Africa, the climate, the scenery, the family, but perhaps nonetheless they feel more at home in Canada and have less of that connection to South Africa. Maybe people want to comment on that.
Well, let's just see how many people are surprised by what we've just described. Anybody surprised? No? Yes, well, then obviously it was true. So let's just, what sets us apart? I think one of the things, obviously, that sets us apart is the accent. But we often hear about other qualities that distinguish us for better or for worse. Confidence, aggression, focus, impatience, openness, rudeness. Ismay, are South Africans different to other Canadians or Canadian Jews, and how do you think this affects us and other people?
It's hard to compare the South African Jews to Canadian Jews. Just talking about South Africans in general, I think that they stand out because they are so much more focused, reliable, hardworking. There seems to be the traits that people talk about when they hear somebody's from South Africa.
There was a comment, Randall, that was in your study that just, I think Isma just said, reminded me of, I don't have it here, but I don't know if you remember, somebody said something about it's really difficult to immigrate. You have to be, do you remember the concept?
You need to be very entrepreneurial, ambitious. It's those who have that drive who are the ones who are going to make that move. Is that what you were thinking?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's what I'm commenting on, that I think that is, seems to be apparent in people looking at South Africans, Jews, of course, as well.
Okay, now let's look at Jewish identity, religious, social, cultural, and Randall, maybe you can just talk briefly about what your study reveals about the patterns in Jewish identities and what the basic reasons are behind those patterns.
Okay. We'll just turn to the. In terms of Jewish identity, when we ask people about how do they identify in terms of denominations, we see that Southern Africans tend to be more traditional, conservative, Orthodox than the mainstream Jewish community or the general Jewish community here in Toronto. So we were able to compare Southern African Jews to the general Jewish community. So more Orthodox, traditional, less Reform, Reconstructionist, secular, just Jewish, which is a new category we're using. But interesting story was when some of the people who would come and they would say, we're Orthodox, and the Canadian Jews might say, you call yourself Orthodox, but you're not keeping Shabbat strictly. So you're Orthodox, and then one of my respondents explained, well, many of us are what we call non-observant Orthodox Jews, okay? We call them non-observant, N-O-O-J. So we are nudges. So this is a new category that I've learned from Southern Africans, the nudges. Which synagogues do Southern Africans tend to belong to? We see here in this list, of course, Chabad of Markham on Green Lane. Many of you are familiar. Yahoo, go Plotkin, Rabbi Plotkin, right? And Rabbitzin Plotkin is wonderful. And but if you look at these synagogues, the 70% of them or so are conservative or Orthodox, in keeping with the inclinations. And an interesting quote here I'll read to you. One particular American-born rabbi who leads an Orthodox congregation that has a significant number of Southern African congregants, I won't tell you which one, was asked in an interview to describe his synagogue, and he answered, whenever I'm asked if we have separate seating in our congregation, I answer, of course. One side Johannesburg, one side Cape Town. We have separate seating. Okay? Clearly, you have made your mark on many synagogues in town. And high levels of attachment to Israel, Zionism, more so than a general Jewish community. And then I would also add higher levels of Jewish education, both in Southern Africa and here, and providing children high levels of Jewish day school education. Probably the most striking of all in terms of Jewish identity are the very low intermarriage rates. we see less than 5% in this study. Of course, this study, we had more older people respond than younger. But if you compare to the British study, it was also the same age group answering, and the intermarriage rate was 12%. And in Toronto, it's at least 18% or perhaps higher. So we have here under 5%. So it's a very distinctive community.
Just on that question of Jewish education, maybe Dara, you can comment on your experience and impressions of it.
Sure. So
Sorry, on the question of Jewish education, I would ask Dara to comment.
I think we noticed in the study that there were both the South Africans back home referenced, many of them had some kind of formal Jewish education, whether it was day school or like a cheder, and then also when they arrived here in the 70s and 80s, sent their children in high numbers to Associated and USDS. And I think one of the things I heard several times was the communities that were formed in the different geographic areas. Somebody referenced it was like a little kibbutz, and that they all sort of supported each other, not getting accustomed to life here. And I think that some of their choices around Jewish day school may have been that sort of their next door neighbors were sending their kids to one school, so they sent their kids to that school because they were forming community in those years. And something else I noticed with sort of Jewish identity is there's sort of it's not necessarily more observant, but more like intention around Jewish observance. So making more decisions, and I think that comes with being here without your family. I always use this expression: if you have to make your own Shabbat, then you are going to think more perhaps than the general community about what kind of Jew you are. I mean, I even know that from living away from home and living in California for many years. We had to really decide that we were going to do what we wanted to do, and you see that with this community as well. In terms of the next generation, so perhaps like for many of you, your grandchildren, I think that those numbers in terms of Jewish education are probably going to be more in line with the rest of the general Jewish community. As many of the people we interviewed said that their children are Canadian, and of course they might marry somebody who's Canadian, and so perhaps that level of connectedness to Jewish identity will be more aligned with the community here, and because of that, sort of they were raised mostly here in Toronto.
Right, and Randall, you mentioned as well connection with Israel. Sorry. You mentioned connection with Israel, Randall. It's interesting when you think about it that the community today in South Africa has moved further to the right in the post-apartheid era. And what did you learn about the relationship among South Africans, ex-South Africans in Toronto with Israel and their political attitudes? And is this sort of continuing into the next generation?
Well, on this slide, again, I can show in terms of high levels of attachment to Israel, and this was, as I said, higher than the general community. I do recall, in terms of Israel politics, more of a right-wing perspective than the British results. You recall that. It'll be interesting to see if that stays consistent with the younger generation. I mean, I would add that that the people that participated in this study were to a large extent 55 years and over, and I was wondering, where are the young people? And it begs the question, because some of the young people I spoke to said to me, well, I'm not sure if I qualify for your study. I was born there, but, I was just a kid. And I wanted them to be part of the study, but it's a matter of self-identifying. And so it really begs the question, who does identify as a Southern African, and how does that affect the composition of the community? Something to think about. This particular slide? It's small for me, and I don't know if it's maybe small for you. Level of attachment to Israel. A strong attachment is the blue, 64%, which was about 10% higher than the general Jewish community in terms of having a strong attachment to Israel. And the orange is a moderate attachment at 29. It's very small for me. And then no attachment, or negative feelings, which are minuscule in this case. The London, pardon me, 10% higher than the London sample. That's correct. In terms of attachment to Israel, maybe you have some theories why Canadian Southern Africans have a stronger attachment to Israel. They are traveling there a lot, not as much as British Southern Africans are. Geographically, it's certainly closer. But on many traditional markers, the Canadian Southern Africans are scoring higher than the British Southern Africans and as general Jewish community in Toronto. So it's quite a distinctive profile.
So I've got to introduce a commercial break here. We've got Mark Finkelstein sitting over there. Mark's working on a big project that Ian Epstein over here was involved in last year, and I think he's coming back next time. It's called Kaleidoscope, which is this program that Eric mentioned. We started, and since you're talking about attachment to Israel, it's a fantastic way to get reattached to Israel. So if there are a number of people in the room who've been involved that you can speak to if you're interested in. But I want to turn to a very important question. It's a question that Lorraine focused on when we looked at the study, and that's the question of the women in the community and in the immigration. I mean, immigration affects, I think it's affected all of us. You know, it presented challenges and it's presented opportunities. There is some literature that Randall used, some academic literature by Stuart and Joan Schoenfeld and Gail McCabe. There was written about some articles about 20 years ago, and one of those articles deals with the effect of the immigration particularly on the women who came. And I'd love to hear, well, first of all, Ismay, you're a woman. Maybe you can comment on this issue, and then I'd like to turn to Lorraine and ask her to comment as well.
Speaking for myself, it didn't have any effect. I came with a career, I came with qualifications, I worked. And I was very lucky in my work life that I was able to achieve quite a bit. But I don't know the experience, and I hate to say this, but I don't know the experience of other women who came here, whether they felt more that they had to do, more that they had to defend, more that they had to do for their families to make them feel at home. I imagine there is a lot of that. And I think probably as the years progressed and more women settled here, and I'm sure they're in this room, developed their own careers, their own businesses. But I really think that in the earlier years, women had a harder time of it. But maybe the women here can raise their hands if they agree.
Thank you. Esme, everything that you say is 100% correct. I think this society is so different to the South African society that, sure, everybody sitting here knows what I'm talking about. The society was so different. There were women who worked out of the home and who were highly professional, doctors, architects, whatever. But by and large, South African women were mostly homemakers, very good homemakers, but homemakers. And coming to Canada opened a new world to them. They firstly, some discovered that they had to go and work because the income that was coming into the house was not sufficient for the family, because Canadian society is much more costly than what we had been used to. But secondly, also the fact that their eyes were open, women's eyes were opened to all sorts of possibilities. And when the kids left home, or went to school all day, and mum was left at home with nothing to do, she said to herself, what about me? I found this amongst a lot of women. I need to find myself as well and aspire to something also other than being my husband's wife or my father's daughter, as we were mostly known to be. And so women went out into the field, into the world, and expanded their horizons. So I found that enormous also for women. And maybe some of you have other reasons or other motivations for women going out to work, and they're all valid.
Any other women in the room who want to say anything
Can we maybe
at this
play a
point?
clip? I have a great clip to play. Okay, Donna, can you please play the clip of Shirley Silberg from Arriving in Canada? Thank you.
Remember, we had no TV, so we had no advertising, so you didn't see these things. You didn't.
And you had servants doing it.
Servants doing it. You never saw a dirty toilet. You never saw a dirty car. Cars were polished and cleaned every day. You never saw dirty shoes. My school shoes were polished and cleaned every day and put down next to my bed, ready. So that was kind of an eye-opener when I realized I had to do some housework, which I did not know how to do. I did not know how to cook. I had to teach myself to cook. And I remember making matzo balls for Yontif, and there was some left over. I wrote to my mother and I said, what do you do with leftover matzo balls? And by the time the letter came back, I mean, they were rotten and gone. She said, who has leftover matzo balls? Which I now know that's true. They obviously weren't that good.
Yeah.
That's why they were left over.
So many of the women express the difficult transition of coming to Canada and having to do domestic work that they weren't used to doing, and their own parents weren't used to doing. And I imagine that it's difficult to all of a sudden have to do that after having so much help back home. And it's something that we could say, oh well, what kind of complaint is that? But I think it must have been very isolating, like Lorraine said, that you're in this place, you don't have any of the support that you had before, and you have to learn how to do these things that were very foreign to you. So I think it must have been challenging.
And I want to thank you, Lorraine, for pushing us and pushing me on this question, right? Because when we tabulated the basic statistics from our answers, the quantitative data, there really was not a significant difference between what the men were answering and what the women. But when you dig a little deeper and you push me to dig, and you look at some interview data, you see that it's a dramatic transition for women in terms of emigrating to a new country, number one, often going to full-time work or much more work than they were doing, number two, and then somehow the women are also in charge of taking care of the household duties. How does that happen, right? And that's number three, and these, no maid anymore, and these are a number of transitions that are happening simultaneously. So there is a lot to say about gender, I think. Thank you again for pushing us on that.
So I want to turn a little bit to social integration. Some ex-South Africans make a point of staying away, as far away as possible from other ex-South Africans. I don't think there's anybody like that in the room, otherwise by definition you wouldn't be here. But others have done the opposite. They've sort of started out in the tribal cocoon and then ventured out later. Can you tell us a bit, Randall, about what the data shows on social integration?
Okay, so if we take a look at the slides. Now, Jews showed remarkable levels of tight-knit friendship networks in general. And I say to my students at York, I'll find a Jewish-looking student in my class and I'll say, think of your top 5 friends. And they'll be thinking, and then I'll say, how many of them are Jewish? And they'll say 5. And I say, wow, how is it that 5 out of 5, Jews are only 4% of Toronto, but 5 out of 5 of your friends are, how is that? And that leads to an interesting discussion about the social cohesion of Jews. Southern Africans, you can multiply that maybe 5 times. In terms of, if you look at the data, those who, for example, emigrated in 2000 and onwards, it says 61% report that all or most of their close friends in Canada are Southern Africans. It's a very high level of friendship networks. And if Jews are 4% overall, we know the Southern African Jews must be, much, much smaller. So something's happening here other than just random association. And what happens with any immigrant group as time goes on, so those who had emigrated in the 1990s or the 1980s, lower levels claim that all or most of their friends are Southern Africans, but I dare say that when you have numbers of 40 or 50% say that most or all, this is a very socially cohesive group overall.
Ismay, you think this is a good thing or not?
I don't know if it fits for you, Ismay.
I'm not sure about this one because I'm not terribly involved in a community, but when I look at communities around me, I look at my family, my relatives, their friends, I think that everything you're saying about the cohesiveness is very, very true in Toronto. It's remarkable. I remember there is a townhouse complex on Bayview where I think something like 80 or 90 of the townhouses were occupied by South African Jews. So that cohesion is really there. Whether it will stay, I don't know. I think it depends on a future immigration to Canada and how they get absorbed and what that does to the existing community.
But as much as there's a lot of cohesion, there's always people who, for various reasons, don't feel part of the larger group and feel a bit marginalized. I interviewed people downtown, for example, who feel that the politics aren't to their liking as much and they prefer to live in a different area of town. Again, this is a community very highly residentially concentrated in certain areas of Toronto, and there's always different facets of any community, different dimensions for sure.
I'm part of the 3% that lives downtown, so I'm a little orphan here tonight. I get the sympathy vote.
So let's flip it around, Darrow. How do ex-South Africans feel about being Canadian?
So I think, as we discussed earlier, they're very grateful for being Canadian, but see their children as definitely are Canadian, whereas they are South African. Maybe we can play the clip of Neville and Ruth Sishi. Donna, please, thank you.
Well, I certainly feel Canadian today. I wanted to feel Canadian from the moment I arrived.
Yeah.
But when did I really feel Canadian? Maybe when I was taking my kids to school, perhaps, that kind of integration.
I definitely feel Canadian and so grateful for that, particularly in today's climate with what's going on in the States. And it's funny because one of my...
States?
Yeah.
Not versus South Africa?
Well, no, I'll get there. But it's interesting because our oldest kid said to me the other day after the election had happened, and he said, I never thought I would really say that I'm so grateful to be a Canadian. But I truly feel that right now. And I think our kids, it's funny, our kids are absolute Canadian. I mean, through and through, they were born here. But somehow they also think they're South African, particularly our daughters. They think they've got this like little South African edge. And they constantly say, that people think they're South African. And they're absolutely not South African. I think...
I think, and then Vivian Rakoff, who we interviewed, if maybe we'll play a short clip of him talking about how wonderful Canada was for him.
One of the wonderful things about Canada is that identity is undefined. As I said many years ago to Peter Zofsky, isn't it a wonderful country where a guy like me, a non-sports loving, my rebellion against South Africa, Jewish guy, a essentially English speaking, from South Africa, can feel totally identified as a citizen because we have it porous.
Porous, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, anybody can be Canadian. It's sort of undefined, and so anybody can
Porous
take it
and
on.
fluid boundaries.
Yeah.
So that's actually a great segue to this question of, we said we'd talk about integration, we'd talk about impact or influence, and it's quite clear. I mean, you've got somebody like Vivian who obviously has had a huge impact on psychiatry in Canada, and so many other examples. So maybe, Ismay, you can comment a little bit about this question of the impact that community has had.
We discussed it, in sort of prior conversations, and I've been thinking about it. The first person who came to my mind, who I think is of international significance, is Jack Diamond, the architect. And then when I went from there, I started thinking, what other South Africans have really, 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 really been important in Canada? And I'm sure there's some good lawyers and some good accountants, but I couldn't think of anybody, to really be honest.
Well, maybe
lawyer
we can
over
ask
here.
from the floor. We'll give you a chance in a few moments when you're going to have an opportunity for questions. What are there lessons from all of this? Are there lessons to be learned? What can the Jewish community do better to support the ex-South Africans? What can the ex-South Africans do better to have an impact on the Jewish and general community in Canada? Let's throw that open. Let's start with Dara. Your thoughts?
Well, from the perspective of the Ontario Jewish Archives, we are so thrilled to add these stories to our collection. And actually, this project has really served as a pilot for how we can reach these other significant immigration groups that have come sort of in the post-Holocaust period, because we noticed that, we obviously have such strong records from the turn of the century up until the Holocaust, and then the migration that came in the 30s, and then the post-war from Eastern Europe. But what we were really missing, the more recent communities that have arrived, the Russian community, the Israeli community, even South American. And we actually thought of tackling the Russian community first, and it was Eric Slavens who's like, why don't you start with the South African community? They're a little bit smaller, and basically one wave of migration. And so we started with this community, and it's proved to be a really fantastic model for us. And it's so important that the Ontario Jewish Archives really makes an effort to make sure we're sharing everybody's stories. And this was our first collection development initiative focused around a group by their country of origin, and I think it's a really good way to make sure that we are truly collecting the wide range of the community, not just the sort of typical Eastern European Ashkenazi story. So, yeah, I think it's been excellent for us.
Randall?
Yes, and along those lines, again, it's been.
It's probably yours.
It's been a pleasure for me to be, maybe once you talk it stops, I don't know, to take part in this study, to gain a better understanding and gain knowledge about this community. And really, to me it's a very impressive story of a community with very high educational levels that they're coming with, very high occupational levels and high levels of income, and then giving back to the community with high philanthropy as well. So in many ways, I mean, this is a community we can learn from. That's adapted and integrated extremely well by many markers. We talked about the Jewish identity and the levels of commitment and engagement in Jewish education, and yet also feeling very at home in their new country. So it's really a model immigrant community in many ways. It's fascinating for me to to gain more knowledge about. Thank you again.
Esme, comments on that?
My comment would be that I think that we're successful, we've done well, but we came here with something. Many of us came with money, with jobs, with families. We're not Syrian refugees. So we had a lot going for us to enable us to achieve what we've achieved here.
There's a comment, I think, in your survey or in some of the literature that you've quoted, reverse immigration, which I think goes to the point that that Isma is making. And that's, you know, most immigrations, certainly within the Jewish world, have been immigrations from sort of poverty to upgrade yourself. And this immigration has been perhaps that ultimately, but has presented many of us with many opportunities. But certainly for many people who were established in South Africa, the early years were difficult, and that's, I guess, leading to the term reverse immigration. On that subject, Colin, would you like to say anything? Colin spent many, many years helping ex-South Africans who come to Toronto find jobs, find contacts. Together with Heather, runs this incredible scholarship fund for students. Do you want to say anything about sort of the immigration process since you've been involved in this project from the beginning? He wasn't prepared for this.
I think one of the big advantages that we have as South Africans is we speak the language. And I'm involved quite a lot with people from Israel, Russia, all over the world who are highly educated, really highly educated, but they can't speak the language. It's a second language to them, and that is very difficult. So I think we as South Africans, when we came here, we came with education, money, etc., but we came with the language, and I think the language plays a big role, and to get work, to be able to open a business, and just generally to communicate, whereas it doesn't necessarily apply to people from other parts of the world. So I think that's one quite important point in our favor, and I think we use it. We do have the, as said earlier, the determination, the education, the drive. I think most of us, when we came, we sold our homes, we sold our businesses, and we had to succeed. There was just no option. And as I say, we had education that was comparatively easy, I think, to the people that are arriving over the last 10 years, the Israelis, the Russians, Indians, Chinese, all highly educated. So I think the language is a big issue. In terms of the volunteer component, there's always need for people that are looking for work, having difficulties, and we do our best to help. Yeah.
Okay, let's have some questions or comments. So the ex-Southern Africans are not known to be shy, so I'm sure. Yeah. Is a microphone closer?
Thanks. I actually just wanted to follow up on a question that Stephen asked Randall, but I don't think we got to that particular point, and that is the question that he asked about the political views of the South Africans, and I think you asked the question, compared to the Jewish community in general, was the South African Jewish community more or less right-wing than the Canadian Jewish community? And I know that many people in this room are from Labour Zionist backgrounds, Habonim, Stephen, and many other people that I see around us today here are people from that background, but I'm just wondering if in your study you were able to come to any evaluation as to whether or not South African Jews tend to be more or less right-wing than the average Canadian Jews.
We don't have direct data comparing to the general Jewish community. My impressions are that it tends to be more conservative and traditional politically. What we do have in the study is a question: would you exchange land for peace in Israel-Palestine? And that question was asked exactly to the British Southern Africans, and I believe 40% in Canada said that they would exchange land for peace, whereas 80% of the British South Africans said they would. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Yeah.
Hello, I came in 1976, and if anybody asked me, what struck me was that as a woman, finally, I could have a world open to me. I wasn't excluded because I'm a woman. I got good jobs, and I could go out at night by myself. I could do all sorts of things that I couldn't do in Johannesburg. Never mind about the housekeeping. That to me is irrelevant. But I really find that this was Canada presented me with opportunities to really develop myself, to develop my skills that I had, but had always earned less, been given the lesser position. The man had the higher position in the school, etc. And this was an open society, and it has been wonderful.
I thought that a big factor in the success of South Africans here was our education, and I'm talking specifically about the school education. When I think about it, I went for free to a public school that had marvelous teachers, Weinberg, had marvelous teachers, wonderful sports fields, excellent sporting programs, and we took it for granted. But in reality, this is a very exceptional thing. I don't know, maybe a Chinese guy from Hong Kong, from a wealthy family, might have had exactly the same kind of schooling system, and I think it's an incredible advantage.
I have a question. My name's Percy Sky. I arrived in Canada in 1957. Toronto for 4 days and I've never left. I see Vivian Rakoff's picture up there, so...
Percy, you didn't even make it onto our chart.
Yeah.
We don't even have any...
Your oral histories are included on the website, so...
Yeah, well, my question is, how many people either in this audience do you know of who have Jewish South Africans who have lived in Toronto for a minimum of 60 years or longer, and how small a group are we at this point?
I can't say that. I've got 50 years.
So how many have 50 years here? Okay. One over there.
Several years ago, on one of my trips to South Africa, I found myself on Muizenberg Beach. And I was among several Australian and Canadian South Africans. And we got involved in a fairly intense discussion of the differences that we had experienced in our immigration. And after I distilled it down at the end of the discussion, what came out of it was very interesting. It was that the men who had gone to Canada were happier than their wives. And the reason was that Canada offered many opportunities, particularly in business and even in professions, much more so than Australia. Australia, being a country that does not have much industry, but basically has more mining and agriculture, which are not Jewish activities, did not offer the same opportunities. Whereas the people who went to Australia, the women were happier because they had gone to a better climate and they found that they could integrate more easily, whereas the men had real trouble in their careers. It was not easy for them to expand their careers and integrate themselves into the economy of Australia. And so that was an interesting comparison, and I just thought you might be interested to hear that.
Yes, it is an interesting observation, and it's interesting also now to see that Australia has become very popular, if not the most popular place in the last 20 years or so, the numbers that we have. So things have shifted perhaps.
Hi. So I know I bring the average age down slightly in the room, but I am born in South Africa at least. My question is, of the people who you sampled, I know you had a few younger people who were part of the group, and I wonder, people who are, so me at least, I came to Canada when I was 15 months old. I'm Canadian as Canadian can be, except I spend my Monday nights at Lippa Green, and I'm curious about the outlooks that you found with South Africans, the outlooks that marked South Africans, like they're more traditional, more Zionist, things like that. If the younger people who you targeted adopted more South African outlooks to some of those points, or more Canadian outlooks?
The sample was quite small with people under 45. We didn't specifically break that down, but impressionistically, yes, the younger ones had closer to a Canadian outlook and a little bit of a gap with their parents. And I think you mentioned that in some cases the parents are hoping to transfer the culture onto their children, and they don't always receive it as much as the parents would like. And I think that's it's a common pattern in many immigrant groups. So a small answer to a very good question.
In respect of jobs, I think one thing that was very important in the early stages, because we spoke English and because most of us when we arrived had jobs, those that came afterwards had a network that they then fed into, which then gave jobs. The Russians don't, or the Turkish or the South Americans do not have. And that network became essential because that's how a lot of people got their original jobs.
Hi, I'm Avis. With regard to the younger gentleman that spoke about what I can identify as the ages of our children, I found that we've got 3 children that were born in South Africa and all have been educated here with master's degrees, but went to first universities in South Africa. I think their connection with being Canadian is based on where they live. We have a daughter who lives outside of Toronto, and she has absolutely no South African friends. And a daughter who lives in Thornhill who has got a lot of South African friends, and a daughter who lives downtown who's only got a few South African friends. I think it's based on your location, and that the only substrata is educated here, but it's where you live, I think, that influences where your friends come from.
Last question, last opportunity. Sure.
Someone who's definitely in the minority tonight, but and as someone whose family came in the 90s, but the 1890s, not the 1990s, but But having said that, that's why we felt very strongly that we better do this study of the people who did the immigration themselves versus their kids or grandchildren, because your experience is the unique experience, and you've got a bunch of Canadians in your next generations who it's going to be very much dissipated with. So that's why there was an urgency to it, and that's why we're hopefully going to do other communities as well. Anyway, I'm just so pleased at the turnout here, though. It's great. Thank you.
Well, Eric, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I want to end by saying thank you all for participating, everybody who's here and those who are not here tonight, who contributed materials, did oral interviews, contributed money, and were part of this, and answered the questions in the survey. And we're part of this really multi-dimensional, incredible project. And I think it's something that, regardless of our perspectives on the immigration, on how important it is that we're part of a ex-Southern African community, I think all these different perspectives obviously have value and enrich the experience of us as a ex-South African community. And I do think that there's been an impact, both individual and collective. I think it's something we can be very proud of, and I thank you all for being part of this tremendous project. And you'll all be receiving a copy of the book. If you've got any comments, please direct them to Dara and her team. And if you've got any documents, materials, that's going to be an ongoing. This project's not over. It's going to be ongoing. You can provide the projects to the archives. And now it's time to celebrate with a dessert reception outside. Thank you all.